Hey, folks, here from California and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Phoenix, Arizona, and Adrian, Michigan, Montreal, Ontario, Coos Bay, Oregon, North Fork of Long Island, Richland, Washington, and that isn't Danny, so it must be a friend. Athens, Georgia, and there we go. We have Indianapolis here from Facebook, as well as Springfield, Missouri. So my team and I are working on a surprise for you all. And I have to say, I was up until 2:30 this morning researching St. Louis, Missouri. So I hope it's worth it in the end of things. Quite an interesting city, actually. All right, so let me jump into some of the questions you asked today in, as usual, a different way than you suggested. Just because there's a lot going on. And, my big thing is keeping your eyes on the big picture. So I'm going to start somewhere you didn't expect me to. And that's with the firing yesterday of Secretary of the Navy John Phelan. Now, we haven't paid a lot of attention to Secretary of the Navy John Phelan. He had no prior military service before Trump made him Secretary of the Navy. He raised a lot of money. He and his wife raised a lot of money for Trump's 2024 campaign, and that's why he got the defense job. But sort of out of the blue yesterday, there was an announcement from the Pentagon that he was out. Yesterday, it was Wednesday. And everybody was kind of like, what? And the story behind why he's out, I think, is in many ways more significant than that he is out. That is, there isn't apparently a scandal or anything. What appears to have happened, and I'm getting this information from the Wall Street Journal and from CNN and from social media, what appears to have happened is that Trump and Pete Hegseth were talking about those battleships that Trump wants to see that have his name on them, and expressed frustration, or this is what came out in the papers, that Phelan seemed to be moving too slowly, or more slowly than he wanted him to. He's a businessman, so one assumes he knows something about how one goes about large projects. But that's me editorializing. That was not in the articles. And I know virtually nothing about Phelan except where he shows up in the news. And so Trump just apparently said to Hegseth, you take care of it. And Hegseth then said to Phelan he was out. And Phelan was like, I talked to Trump yesterday and there was no sign of this. There's nothing going on. So he didn't actually believe it had happened. And he insisted on speaking to Trump directly. And that's when the Pentagon spokesperson put out a statement saying, thank you for his service. He's gone. And Phelan went to Trump and said, am I fired? And Trump then had to tell him in person, yes, indeed, you're out. Which, if you think about Trump, he never likes to do his own dirty work. This is, he's famous for hiding behind lawyers, hiding behind somebody else. And in this case, Phelan went to him and said, really? And the reason that I'm focusing on that, it was so much else going on, is because I was actually reading Trump's social media feed yesterday. And one of the things that jumped out in the middle of the day was all of a sudden 3 times he posted stories about how wildly successful his Apprentice TV show had been. Where, of course, his famous line was, you're fired, even though he really, it was a scripted show. It wasn't, reality TV is pretty heavily scripted. And he didn't really do that himself. It was all an act. And the fact that he seemed to go running back to, boy, I was really successful and I did this in the past, strikes me as being deeply problematic, that he doesn't feel like he's in control of his administration. And by that, I mean, I don't feel like he's in control of his administration, but that there is a weird overlap there of Hegseth taking on power that Trump may or may not have wanted him to have, and then Trump sort of having to deal with the fallout and instantly running to, I was really successful when I did this on TV. And then today, again on social media, he posted only great things about former Secretary Phelan and saying, I'd love to see him back in the administration. So there's this really weird, what's going on in the White House moment with the the firing of the defense secretary, who appears simply to have been on Pete Hegseth's radar screen for somebody he didn't like. And we know Hegseth is working really hard to consolidate power within his own hands in the military. So I'm going to start there because I think it's important. It's an important window into Trump losing control of his administration, just from what it looks like on the outside. So that jumped out to me, and you all asked about that. But there's a couple of other things that are, I think, significant right now for where the Trump administration is. So you asked about the Democrats being so furious that James Comer, the chair of House Oversight and Reform, is apparently no longer going to hold hearings, that he's going to hold roundtables instead, for the simple reason that he doesn't want to swear anybody in. Now, this is a big deal. And sort of my theme today is information. Who's got information and how do you know what information is out there? And one of the things I've harped on now for years is that the Republicans are really good at acting as if they are giving out information, but they're lying. And they're not doing it under oath. So after the 2020 election, for example, Rudy Giuliani kept holding what he called hearings, and he set them up to look as if it was a courtroom. But in fact, nobody was sworn in. Anybody could say anything they wanted to. And what Comer is up against in oversight and reform is the Epstein files. And the Republicans on oversight and reform are siding with the Democrats to say, we want to see members of the Department of Justice here under oath talking about their release of the Epstein files. Because remember, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act on November 19th of 2025. And that law, it's not a suggestion, that law says that the Department of Justice has to release all of the Epstein files. All of the Epstein files no later than December 19th, with very limited redactions. And by the Epstein files, remember, there's a lot of different sort of buckets of information from the arrest and investigation of sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. But what we're talking about when we talk about the Epstein files is what the FBI pulled together in its investigation. So some of the stuff that's been coming out actually is not from that. It's the things like the birthday card that came from Epstein's estate, which is another bucket. But the Epstein files are the FBI files, and to date, the Department of Justice has released less than half of them, and they're simply saying, "Well, the rest are duplicates. We're not going to release them." Which again, the fact they're trying to hide this, and now they're saying they're duplicates. Well, if they're duplicates, release them, right? Then we just won't read them twice. They're pretty clearly covering something up. And both the Democrats and a number of the Republicans on the House Oversight Committee are saying, hand those babies over, because a lot of MAGA Republicans care a lot about that as well. And so what they did is they subpoenaed then Attorney General Pam Bondi to come testify under oath on April 14th. And Trump fired her before that could happen. So she didn't show up for her deposition, saying, I'm not the Attorney General any longer, and therefore I don't have to, which the Democrats are proceeding to hold her in contempt of court, not criminal contempt, which would go to the Department of Justice and get dismissed, but civil contempt, which would go to a different judge who might hold her in contempt. But until then, obviously the person to go to now is the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who was Trump's personal attorney and the one who talked to Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's associate, and gave her that real sweetheart deal where she's now in a prison camp, which is not the kind of wartime prison camp that we think of. This is, instead of being incarcerated in a security prison, it's a place where there's gardens and you can be outside, and it's sort of a much more lower security prison than a sex offender should have been in. So the question now is, if in fact the members of the House Oversight and Reform Committee keep insisting that they want to hear from these people, Comer is simply going to say, well, sure, well, they'll come in and talk to you, but they're not going to be under oath. So what good does that do anybody? And this is something to watch for a lot going forward. Always, who's under oath and who is not, and whom do you trust and why? What is their angle? What are they trying to do? Always think about that when somebody is out making a statement. And one of the things you really, really have to pay attention to is the number of times that the Republicans will say one thing to the cameras, but then when they're under oath in a court of law, the story changes a lot. And that's what you saw after the 2020 election, for example. That's what you saw in-house oversight and reform when Comer tried to go after Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden, and kept saying, oh, we know all this stuff. We have all this information and so on and so forth. But then when the witnesses were sworn in, they couldn't produce anything. So watch who's getting sworn in and why. And this attempt of Comer to get rid of witnesses swearing in before Congress is completely unacceptable. I mean, basically, that's saying that the American people have no right to know the truth. And that's, of course, at the end of the day, what all of this is about is who gets to know what, and what does that say about our government. All right, so there's another big thing about the administration right now, in addition to the fact that Trump seems not to be in control of the administration, and that they're still very, very worried about what might come out about the Epstein files. And that's, of course, Iran. So I've talked again and again about how Trump did not intend for Iran to become this boondoggle that he's, if that's the right word, I'm not sure it is, this complete mess that he's in, and that the rest of the world is now in, thanks to his attack on Iran. And Iran's ability simply to survive has made it, given it real credibility against the United States of America. Remember, it was significantly weakened in the last several years. And now, of course, Trump has made it appear much more powerful and has given it very real power by its recognition that it can simply strangle the world's economy by shutting the Strait of Hormuz, which is what's happened. And Trump has tried everything to try and reopen that strait, and first by bombing and insisting that he had won, and then by trying to get our allies to help him open the strait, and then again simply declaring that the strait was open, and then threatening that he was going to destroy Iran altogether. And he's tried basically everything he can, and the Iranians still keep saying, last we checked, we're still in control of this strait. So what you saw today and what you're starting to see today in the news, and this is Thursday, of course, so tomorrow I fully expect we're going to get some wonderful news from Trump saying, everything's solved and it was going to be great, because he's going to be trying to game the markets again before over the weekend, which he's done every single weekend so far. But what you're seeing is the recognition now in the White House and among Republicans that even if the strait magically opened tomorrow and we went back to February 27th, or the conditions of February 27th, it's going to be at minimum months before the world economy is going to come back. And a lot of people are saying either years or it's never going to come back because of the dramatic destruction in the Middle East, but also the reworking of relationships there. So you're suddenly seeing Trump today again on social media, but he's actually given a number of talk to journalists today saying, don't rush me. I'm in no hurry. I've got all the time in the world. It's Iran that desperately needs to reopen the strait. And the truth of the matter is the entire world is suffering, including Iran. But in many ways, Trump seems to be simply throwing up his hands and saying, I'm happy with things the way they are. I win. And the problem with that, of course, is that the rest of us have to live with that world where we've got dramatically increasing energy costs. And that, in a funny way, this is one of the great things about being a historian is, I don't like to predict what's going to happen. I like to talk about what I can say has happened. But it's a little hard for me to imagine that the rest of the world is not going to look at where we are right now and think, oh boy, we better switch away from fossil fuels much more quickly than we had thought to, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what Trump's trying to make the United States and the rest of the world do. We keep saying, come to the U.S., we got plenty of oil. But why would anybody trust the U.S. at this point? And so, you're already seeing electric vehicles sales dramatically increase around the rest of the world after the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, again, the problem is you can't turn an economy or a country's economy, but certainly a world economy on a dime. And so this is going to take a long time to work through the pipeline. And even though Trump is trying desperately to blame the Democrats for it, he really, really, really is one of the real problems with him deciding he's going to do everything on his own, is that there's really no one else to blame. He did this on his own. So it's going to be a hard sell for people for him, to say, oh yeah, we agree it's somebody else's fault, because he broke it. He owns this one. And you can see the results of that with all of the polls that are coming out that are showing him dropping lower and lower and lower. On every topic, he's underwater, except he did blip up in a recent poll to 51% of people like what he's doing on the border. That has been underwater. It did blip up the other day. But, if you're looking to run and win as a Republican in 2026 and certainly in 2028, there's real concern on their part about that. And that, that, of course, comes back to the desperate attempt on the part of the Republicans to game the 2026 election through gerrymandering, among other things, these mid-district gerrymandering, but also voter suppression. You asked about the SAVE Act. That appears to be dead in the Senate, at least for now. But all these attempts to try and just jigger the vote in such a way that they'll be able to retain control of both houses of Congress, because if they don't, Trump has already said he's convinced he's going to be impeached, and I would be shocked if he's not, in addition to other things going on as well. All right, so that's sort of the backstory right there. But if that's the backstory, what then is the administration and is the country doing? Well, while this administration appears to be crumbling, and it seems pretty clear now, it's very hard to think it's not true, that the Trump administration and the people in it are basically trying to get as much money as they can out of the system. And that's our tax dollars, by the way. And it's our tax dollars going to things like contracts, the really large contracts that people like Jeff Bezos or like Elon Musk have with the U.S. government that they don't want to lose, but also contracts into things like the fact the Eric Trump and I believe his brother Don Jr., have invested in a drone company that just got a $24 million contract from the Pentagon. And you've watched Trump getting more and more upset about the tariffs and how the Supreme Court has called his Liberation Day tariffs unconstitutional and says he's got to pay back the money. The Treasury has to pay back the money, and he's getting more and more upset about that. Well, what did the tariffs let him do? The tariffs let him basically extort money from other countries or leaders, or extort favors like Vietnam gave him when they enabled him to fast track a golf course in Vietnam in order to get a lower tariff rate. If he loses that leverage over other countries. And so when he's screaming about how upset he is about losing the tariffs, part of it is that he was hoping to be able to get rid of income taxes because he doesn't want to pay income taxes. But part of it was, and he wanted to switch that cost down onto people like us. But also part of it is that he lost that leverage. So partly there's just smash and grab here. And I want to call your attention to something I wrote about, I think it was last night, but it's a little complicated, so I think people maybe didn't see it. And that's that the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE, have come to the U.S. Treasury, our money, to say, we're in real trouble financially over here because of the Iran war. Can you backstop our currency? Can you help us out of this situation since you pretty much started it? And Trump is now considering doing that. That is worth remembering when you see those stories. Many of them don't mention the fact that shortly before Trump became president, the one of the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, who is responsible for a sovereign wealth fund over there, bought 49% of the Trump family's World Liberty Financial cryptocurrency, thereby putting money directly into Trump's pockets because of the way the deal was done, but then also used the USD1 stablecoin from World Liberty Financial. And essentially what that meant, I know cryptocurrency is incredibly confusing, but essentially what that meant was he invested that money in a stablecoin to hold it for another deal. And what the way those deals tend to be written is that the person holding that stable coin gets to invest it however that fund wants to, and then gets to keep whatever they make from it. So essentially this investment gave Jared Kushner, Kushner's in a different deal. This gave the Trump family this huge pot of money to use. And now, having given that money to the Trumps, the UAE is coming to us to say, hey, how about ponying up some cash? And the Trump family is saying, or not the Trump family, the president is saying, sure, we'll take a look at that. And that kind of self-dealing is all through this administration. One of the reasons it's really, really hard to follow it is because there's so much of it. So, for example, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are the ones theoretically negotiating an end to the Iran war. And at the same time, as you say, Jared Kushner has a $2 billion investment that he's working with from the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia that is controlled by Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS. And while they're doing this theoretical negotiating, they're also trying to get more investments over there. So, what you're seeing is this destruction of a democratic government that works for the people, and the replacement of that with an oligarchic government that works for this one family and their cronies. And that looks very much like the kind of government you see in Russia, and like the government you saw under Viktor Orban in Hungary, that, of course, has recently been voted out. So while they're trying to do that, they have a little bit of a problem. They have a lot of problems, but they have a little bit of the problem of the fact that the American people don't like this. So one of the other things that you're seeing in the administration right now is an attempt to cow opposition, that is, to frighten opposition. And you've seen this across the board in things like the attempt to bring criminal charges against those 6 members of Congress who urged members of the military not to obey illegal orders, or the attempt to bring a criminal case against the Fed secretary, the secretary of the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, Jerome or Jay Powell. You've seen it in the attempt to bring criminal charges against Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York. You've seen it in the attempt to bring criminal charges against or to threaten universities and law firms and so on. And what you've seen, though, with all of those things is that those who stood up to the president succeeded. But there's a real problem, a huge problem, and that's that it's expensive to stand against the United States government. And one of the things that you see with these cases is the administration trying desperately to frighten other people into not speaking up. And that's really what their MO is here. The attempt to convince the people who are reading the media that those standing against the administration are somehow evil, because they're going to see all these headlines about Mark Kelly, the Arizona senator, for example, or Jason Crow, the representative from Colorado, or Alyssa Slotkin, who was also in that video. And you see enough stuff, you start to believe it, even if it's untrue. Again, the issue that I'm talking about today is who knows what, and what is true and what is not true. In the same way that a number of people believe that Trump actually won the 2020 election, which he did not. They simply have heard it so much they have come to believe it. And so they're trying to seed all this stuff in the media. But they're also trying to frighten their opponents into shutting up. And that brings me to the other question that you asked about, and that was the Southern Poverty Law Center Tuesday, first in the morning announced that it was under criminal investigation. And then the Department of Justice that evening, Tuesday evening, announced that it had indicted the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Kash Patel, the head of FBI, who's in his own hot water, right? He called it a massive sweeping indictment, charging that they had committed fraud. Well, the actual indictment is deeply, deeply problematic. And I'm not going to go into the details of it. Plenty of other people have explained them. Just suffice it to say, it's another one of those real long shots that really seems designed primarily to convince people that the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has done yeoman's work in taking down the KKK, for example, is somehow fraudulent, is somehow corrupt. And you're going to see these stories coming out more and more, I'm sure. And again, the same way that you saw all those stories about, Joe Biden being corrupt, even though there was no evidence of that at all. And people believe it. I still see all the time, well, what about Joe Biden and China? There was never any evidence of that, but people heard it enough that they believed it. So what you're seeing with the Southern Poverty Law Center lawsuit is an attempt, first of all, to cow other people into shutting up, to cost the Southern Poverty Law Center a lot of money, and to convince people that those doing work to protect American democracy are the bad guys, and those people standing with Trump are the good guys. And you're seeing that in a number of different ways. You're seeing it, among other ways, in the Department of Justice under Trump, giving financial rewards to people that were convicted of collaborating or working with the Russians in 2016. For example, you saw the Department of Justice settling with Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor for Trump, who pleaded guilty to talking to Russian operatives to Sergei Kislyak, who was the Russian ambassador, but pretty close to Putin and known as a Russian operative before Trump took office, and then lying about it to the FBI. And today, I think it was, or maybe it was yesterday, there was an announcement that the Department of Justice has settled with Carter Page, who was an aide into Trump's 2016 campaign, for him being swept up in a wiretap of in the Russia investigation. So he's really pardoning people who support him, giving our tax dollars to those people. He's sued his own IRS for some extraordinary sum of money that, again, they're talking about a settlement. We'll see how much he walks off with. It's in the billions. You're seeing the real use of our government to put money in the pocket of Trump and his cronies in order to make us look much more like Russia or like Viktor Orban's party did, which is, one of the reasons that they were concerned about Orban's dramatic loss the other day on April 12th. But now there's another place that you're seeing their real attempt to grab power. And that's in the expansion of this sort of secret security state in the United States. And one of the things to watch for is a new bill that has just come up in the Senate to renew the funding for federal agents, including ICE and Border Patrol, for 3 years with no oversight, which is really astonishing if you think about what the Democrats have demanded to fund, to bring more federal funding, to bring more funding to those federal agents. What they've asked for is literally for those agents to respect the conditions that courts imposed before Trump changed those just by fiat by just declaring it, to say things like you got to have a judicial warrant to break down somebody's door and go into it. That's the Fourth Amendment. This is not controversial and was not controversial before Trump took office. And, to actually have their names on their uniforms and not to be masked and to do all the things that have been part of American history and part of American law until now. Now the Senate is talking about finding a way to fund ICE for the rest of Trump's term without any oversight, without any new oversight. And you can see there too, I think, real concern that the more people know, the more they learn what's happening with ICE, because everything that's come out has been really, probably not everything, that's an exaggerated word. The vast majority of the stuff that people are now seeing about what ICE has done, both to the people it has incarcerated, but also to American citizens, is pretty appalling. And so clearly they don't want more of that to come out. They're trying to make sure that doesn't come out while Trump is still in office or while a Republican is still in office. And remember, a lot of the stuff that they have set up is designed to hit after the midterms. For example, the real cuts in what they call the big beautiful bill act will happen after the midterms, so that the Democrats might be back in power, even though it's been set up all this time. And it looks like they're trying to make sure the same thing is going to happen with ICE and with Border Patrol. So you're seeing that, but you're also seeing a real fight now over the reauthorization of FISA, or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act has a section in it called Section 702. And Section 702 is the one that provides for the surveillance of foreign intelligence, of foreign of people who are not in the United States. And the Democrats and a number of Republicans have wanted reforms out of 702 because it have wanted reforms. I'm sorry, I'm very tired. Have wanted reforms in 702 because U.S. citizens often get swept up in that warrantless surveillance, and then it's possible to surveil them as well, which you're not supposed to do without a judicial warrant. And there's been real pushback against that. And now again, the Senate has set a vote for extending that surveillance for 3 years with no reforms for Tuesday. So we have two of those things back on the table. The idea of finding a way to fund federal agents for the rest of Trump's term without any reforms, and now also for refunding and reauthorizing FISA, and including 702 with no reforms for the rest of Trump's term. So you've got both of those things on the table now as well. All right. So what's the overall picture here? The overall picture is, the attempt to get rid of American democracy and turn it into basically a cash cow for a personalist regime for Trump and his cronies. And you can see this attempt on Trump's part to create loyalties from people who are getting paid off and therefore are willing to do whatever he wants them to do to keep him in office. But you're also seeing breaks in that. So Justin's son, who was a cryptocurrency billionaire, is a cryptocurrency billionaire, who was looking for Trump's help to get out of a number of Department of Justice investigations, and invested a ton of money in Trump's cryptocurrency. And then the cases went away earlier this year. He is now suing World Liberty Financial, I think it is. He's suing one of the Trump cryptocurrencies because he says that they have defrauded him. And, he still says, I love President Trump. I just don't trust these other people who are working in that cryptocurrency venture. And so they, you can see them cracking a little bit, being some cracks in this, I'm on your team, but it's pretty clear that even if you start out being on Trump's team, you're not going to stay on Trump's team. And I guess that's one of the final things to note. Somebody asked if if I had advice coming from a period that looked very much like this, the destruction of Reconstruction and the centering of power among the robber barons in the late 19th century, in part because of the destruction of democracy in the American South and in parts of the American North during first Reconstruction and then in the robber baron era, which I'm not going to go into right now. And the answer to that is, I think we have a huge advantage now that that they didn't have then, and that's in the enormous effect of instantaneous communications and news. So when you see somebody nowadays being abused by a federal agent, for example, it pretty quickly goes into the public sphere. And that's why you have to be real careful about what kind of information you're getting and whether or not it's real. And, there are a lot of AI news stations out there right now. And you just got to be careful about that. And I'm being AI'd everywhere. I only have one official YouTube channel, one official Facebook channel. I also have a personal Facebook channel, but I don't do anything on that. That's just personal. I don't do anything political on that. I have one Instagram channel. Anything you see that looks like me, that on Facebook or anywhere else that is not on one of those channels, or it hasn't been identified as my channel, that's probably going to be AI. It's probably going to be fake, and they put a lot of crap out there. But it's not just me; it's happening to everybody. So be a really smart consumer of news. But what it means is that we can see these patterns, and one of the things that Trump is really hammering on now, and his people are really hammering on, is white supremacy, white nationalism, getting rid of Americans of color, getting rid of Black Americans, really making people of color, Black Americans, and women, really reading them out of American history, reading them out of the body politic, trying to make sure they can't vote. And that worked during Reconstruction, and women didn't vote then, but it worked. And it worked in part because people couldn't really see what was happening in some of the laws. And I've talked about those laws before, but some of the laws seemed like they made sense. It was only when you saw the bigger pattern that you saw that what was really going on. And you can see that same thing happening today, but you also have so many of us saying, wait a minute. They're not really trying to get rid of voter fraud, because voter fraud isn't a thing. What they're really trying to do is stop Democrats from voting, or stop their opponents from voting, because right now their opponents are also independents and Republicans. So we're able to see the larger patterns, but I think also crucially, during Reconstruction, when white Americans looked at those laws going into place and recognized that they were hurting Black Americans primarily, but also brown Americans, Indigenous Americans, Chinese Americans, and so on, they thought it couldn't happen to them. And one of the things that is really clear as you're watching the destruction of the U.S. government and the lack of investment in healthcare and in food and now in these rising prices because Trump started this war in Iran, when you're watching what's happening to ordinary Americans of all stripes, I think it's very hard for anybody now to make the argument that whatever happens with the destruction of democracy is only going to affect them, however you want to define them. I think it's pretty clear that we are all in this together. And the good news for that is that we now have, this time around, women, people of color, voting. And we have them able to exercise their ability to push back on the destruction of American democracy. So there's a lot going on right now, and it's really confusing. And things like the sudden firing of the Secretary of the Navy was kind of like, huh? What's going on there? And the thing with the Southern Poverty Law Center was also kind of like, what's happening? I think what you're seeing are these big patterns of an attempt to consolidate power through the manipulation of media, the manipulation of people's impressions, because the administration recognizes just how profoundly unpopular and at this point unable President Trump is. And the people around him are not a lot better. So what I'm going to tell you to do, I'm going to tell you once again to keep speaking up, keep keep putting pressure on people now. Speak up about not reauthorizing the Surveillance Act without reforms to it. Speak up about, and these are common sense reforms, like you got to have a judicial warrant to spy on an American, which is the Fourth Amendment, right? This is not rocket science here, that we don't want to see federal agents behaving the way they have been until now. We want them to have, for example, a judicial warrant to break down somebody's door the way they had to before January 20th, 2025. So speak up. And as you speak up, talk about the stuff you want to see happen and have a little fun with it. This is now our time to rebuild American democracy, and people are doing it. They're out there talking about what kind of investments they want to see in schools and in hospitals. And, I always focus on that stuff because it's the way that kind of I'm trained in the 19th century. But, you got people like J.B. Pritzker out there talking about how he feels that the economy should be rebuilt. Where does he want to see businesses? How do you want to see that work? Do you care about small businesses? What do you think about antitrust law? There's this new antitrust organization. What things do you think are important in your life going forward or in other people's lives? And when you think about that, and when you get involved in those worlds, you're going to meet new people, you're going to have a really good time, and you're going to be able to re-envision what this country should look like. And that's where we are now, is having both to fight the attempted destruction of democracy, but also having to re-envision what the future looks like. And it's high time. It's really high time with all the things we have to face. Climate change is always top of the list for me, but education and health and all the places that this administration has shown not just how impoverished it is, but also how impoverished Americans have been by starving those things for the last 40 years. Now is our chance to decide where we want to invest again, and how we're going to do it. Again, one of the places I'm going to be putting effort in is in taxes and tax policy, which I find fascinating. And I'm sure some of you just fell sound asleep thinking, I don't want to do that. You don't have to, because I'll work on that. But this is the time we get to figure out what we want going forward. And we need everybody's voices. The ones you don't agree with is as much as the ones you do agree with, because that's how we come up with good ideas and how we move the ball forward. All right. Thank you for being here, and I will talk to you. I'm not sure what my schedule looks like for the rest of the week, but I will post it so you'll have a sense of when I'm going to be around. Thank you for being here.